Hey guys, welcome to this episode of the BDC Debate Academy. This episode is going to be a really unstructured discussion on big tech. To those who don't know what that is, I'll be describing it in a bit. It's also going to be a discussion on like a lot of issues that exist in the same universe as big tech. So issues like data, handling data, privacy issues, stuff like that. So the way I intend for this episode to be is not going to be like a breakdown of different motions that come up within the big tech space in debating. It's more going to be like a factual walkthrough through the area that is big tech. And we'll take some specific arguments that are like most general when it comes to these issues, and we'll break them down, see merits of each and demerits of each. So yeah, that's how this is going to be conducted. It's more going to be like a walkthrough through the area. Anyways, so let's get to it. Right. So what is big tech? Big tech refers to basically a group of extremely large companies, most of which I'm sure almost everyone is aware of. Some of the largest companies in the world, in fact, some study somewhere found that 5 of the 6 largest companies in the world are tech companies. These companies, they generally have certain characteristics that give them really unattainable power. So I'll give you a few examples and show you how they conduct their business. But generally, the common characteristic between all of these is scale. They're huge. So huge in the sense that they have incredible resources. They also have incredible access to data. They also have the ability to perform R&D at a scale that smaller companies could not possibly think of. This is for a lot of reasons, which we'll explore one by one. So famous names, Google, Amazon, Microsoft. These companies are big, but also like incredibly diversified. They don't have one specific product. So Google, as we all know, comes from Google search, but that's like a really small part of their business. It's not a really small part in the sense that it contributes a lot to their revenue, but it's like one component of a much bigger puzzle. Amazon, most people know it as a marketplace where things are sold digitally, you get stuff delivered. But funnily enough, Amazon's biggest space right now has nothing to do with the marketplace. It has everything to do with AWS and basically providing software and digital infrastructure for other companies. So that's a big part of their business. Microsoft, Windows, what else? Xbox, and Azure, which is a competitor for AWS. Basically, very diverse businesses. Another famous name is Apple, which sells hardware, which is how most people know it, in the sense that you know their iPhones, you know Macs. But the interesting thing about Apple is it's completely vertically integrated. So what this means is that it's one company that does it all, in the sense that they source their own hardware to the point where even the processors are often made primarily by Apple. iPhone processors are designed by Apple. And soon Mac processors are supposed to be ARM based. And so those will be designed by Apple as well. They design their own software, they design their own services. So Apple is what you might call the complete tech package, in the sense that it does a bit of everything. Facebook, also very big, perhaps a bit more narrow in its scope than the other companies mentioned here, but it has complete control over that scope. So Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook itself, that's Facebook. So yeah, those are some of the companies we'll be dealing with. But also, when we say big tech, we generally don't just mean these 5 companies or like these 6 or like these 7. We just mean the general notion of really large tech companies with like a lot of resources. So the biggest issue when it comes to tech companies, and the biggest complaint when it comes to tech companies, has for a long time been antitrust. So this term came up like back in the 90s with Microsoft. So I know, I'm sure the term came up before. I meant when applied to the tech space. So the reason it came up back then was because Microsoft was getting really big. to the point where competition was completely missing out, in the sense that it was incredibly difficult to compete with Microsoft. A more recent example can be applied to like just about each of the big tech companies that I mentioned before, because each of them dominate the space in such a way that it's difficult for competitors to work within that space. But the issue here is that the general argument about competition, of it being good, of it being like something you need in a proper free market, is not the same here. It's very complex. So, for instance, to give you a little example, Amazon dominates the ebook space. It's how they started. It used to be a bookstore, digital bookstore, and then they became a ebook. Then they sold ebooks, and now they sell everything. Anyways, one of the interesting aspects of Amazon's business model is the price. It is incredibly low. It's low to the point where any other competitor finds it really hard to match those prices. So back in the 2000s, when Amazon was dominating the ebook space, 5 much smaller companies, HarperCollins, Penguin, and others, they decided to collude and raise book prices, which is really strange because in a typical monopolistic situation, you have the monopoly having higher prices because they can, and because they can get away with it because no competition exists. In this case, the company being accused of running a monopoly has the lowest prices, and competing smaller companies are forcing prices to go higher because they simply cannot survive on margins that small, which Amazon can survive on. So what then happened was the Justice Department in turn filed an antitrust suit against these 5 companies for colluding. So the strange thing here is that the issue that we need to discuss is, what are monopolies and why are they, when are they bad? So for example, in this situation with Amazon selling you like really cheap stuff, who really wins or who really loses? Because the way you see it, the way we can evidently see it, is that it's good for consumers. You get cheap stuff. And we'll get to this a bit later. Amazon has other things that are really good for consumers. Who it's bad for is competitors. And so why did we think monopolies were bad to begin with? Was it because competition in itself is necessarily good, or because competition leads to lower prices and better things for consumers, and therefore the lack of it is bad? So I think if the consensus is that monopolies are bad because it's bad for consumers, then the same argument cannot simply be applied here. Because at the end of the day, if that is the issue, then in many cases, you will see that big tech monopolies are really good for consumers. They're bad for competitors and they're bad for the competition in general. One might even argue that thinking that it's good for consumers is short-sighted, because bad for competitors means eventually they'll take advantage of, the monopolies will take advantage of their current position. But even then, it's complicated. So basically, the issue with big tech is being a monopoly leads to lower prices, leads to better things. We'll get into this in more detail. So first, let's take a look at one of the famous cases against big tech, which was run by Elizabeth Warren it was a big part of her platform for the presidential election. She proposed breaking up big tech, and she levied 2 main complaints. It was a lot more diverse than what you see here, but like I'm summarizing it into 2 broad areas. The first complaint is pretty self-explanatory. It's that big tech often merges to prevent competition. Now, merge is very charitable. Often, this is we can replace this term with the term acquisition. So, for instance, what generally happens is if there's a smaller entity that comes up with a superior product, or often these smaller companies, they come up with a new niche that big tech didn't consider before. So before these companies can get large, or before these companies can pose a threat, big tech generally attempts to buy them off, or like attempts to get the product somehow. And through these acquisitions, they prevent future threats from coming up. So that's one. The other is more interesting. It's that big tech will often have and have a pretty clear conflict of interest in the way that they conduct their businesses. So, for example, Google search operates by giving you the promise that it gives you results that are most relevant to what you're looking for. But then one of the complaints that Elizabeth Warren brought up was that in the process of doing so, Google search often deprioritizes content from the competition. In the same vein, another complaint was that in the Amazon marketplace, you often see Amazon prioritizing their own Amazon Basics line. Not only is that apparently harmful for competitors, it's also worse because Amazon Basics line is so cheap in the sense that it's a lot of cost cutting that they do. And so as a result of which, their own products look much better in the marketplace in which they're supposed to be selling everything. And so that looks really bad for competitors. As a result of which, Elizabeth Warren claims that these companies are preventing competition, they're preventing a diverse array of ideas in the marketplace, and they're dominating. Now, the issue with this argument, again, as you can notice, is that the argument relies primarily on competition and doesn't really deal with consumers as much. So it's about increasing competition. Now, the analogy here is not accurate in the sense that this isn't a situation that's analogous to big oil or big pharma. Like in those cases, so for instance, in big pharma, if you've patented something and you have a cure for something, there's a distinct incentive to ask really high prices. So like in America, the price for insulin is insane. Those sorts of things. Those incentive structures don't apply for big tech. And so the business runs very differently. Revenue rarely comes from the product itself in this space. So for instance, Google's product being Google Search, one of their products being Google Search, it doesn't cost you money to perform a search on Google. Similarly, it doesn't cost you money to use Facebook. So the money for these companies comes from advertising, which is like a side consequence of the product in itself. And for advertising to be profitable for these companies, there's a distinct incentive for you to keep things as cheap as possible. Because to get more clicks on your ads, you need more people browsing, you need more people using the service. And so the way to get more people to use the service is to generally keep it cheap or keep it free. So the incentive structure is completely different. Here, you want things to be as free as possible so that you reach as wide a base as possible. And so through that reach, you make money. And so often, these monopolies end up being really good for consumers, as we discussed earlier, because things are cheap. But also, very interestingly, monopolies are actually kind of inevitable in this space. So one of the important things to remember is that in tech, the production cost can be incredibly high. So to set up all the server space that you'd need, to set up the infrastructure that you'd need, often means that you don't make any profit for a very long time. So a famous example is Amazon being in debt for like 7 years before they made any profit, $2 billion in debt, in fact. The weird thing is, by the time you start making profit in this industry, you are already incredibly large. The reason you were able to make profit in the first place is because you had all of that set up, which allowed you to make profit. So by the time you're profitable, i.e. by the time you're going to be a long-lasting player in this space, you are a huge player in that space by definition. As a result of which, you are already sort of kind of a monopoly. But even more interestingly, if you consider like the information advantage that these companies have, generally you will see that monopolies are largely inevitable. So one of the most important things on which these companies operate is data. Most of the products that are sold are data-driven. So for instance, I don't know, face recognition works better if you have more faces to work with. And so if a company is offering face recognition, just a very basic example, a company that has more access to data will likely make the better face recognition product. So the issue that happens here is, if you have a product that is even slightly better in these cases, and if you're talking about a large base of consumers that are using these products generally for free or like for very small amounts of money, these consumers can be really fickle. So if someone has even a marginally better product, people will move fast. So in the sense that, not a completely relevant example, but just consider how fast people move from MySpace to Facebook. So what generally happens is the more data you have, the higher the chances are that you have a slightly better product. And if you have a slightly better product, you get a lot more customers, because in this space, customers can be fickle. If you have a lot more customers, you then generate a windfall of additional data, which eventually means you have even more data to make your product even better. At that point, your product is probably so good, it is unlikely that a new competitor will ever be able to compete, because you have outdated them, if that's the term. Anyways, the point being, it's a cycle where like it's self-fulfilling. The more data you have, the better product you have. The better product means more people use it, which means you get even more data, which means your product gets even better, and you have a monopoly. So in general, it is evident that monopolies will happen. And so it might be misguided to want to break it up, because this entire thing is in the fabric of this business, and breaking it up gets in the way of how breaking up big companies gets in the way of how they operate. We'll get into this in a bit. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what these monopolies have to offer for consumers. Discussed a lot of this already. So like the internet is everywhere, which means, and most of these products which these companies are selling are internet based, which means if these products are better, it's better for everyone, and almost everyone has access to these products. So when big tech experiences economies of scale, it isn't like when, say, the auto industry experiences economies of scale, because there's an inherent barrier to entry. Like when it comes to almost any other industry, like you have to buy the car to be able to understand that this car is now cheaper and that this car drives better. As opposed to in this space where, like, if you have the internet, you generally get the benefit of all these products. That's one. So the most important thing to keep in mind is that the reason these things are free and what keeps these things free is the size. So these companies have their toes dipped in multiple businesses, and they have a lot of safety nets to work with, which allows these things to be free. So for instance, like it costs incredible amounts of money to develop like the predictive models which allow for the location detection that you get in a lot of services. Also like just free Google Maps. Like imagine the amount of resources that took. And the reason Google Maps was free is because, and also like you don't see a lot of ads on Maps anyways. Revenue from there comes from selling the Maps API, but that's irrelevant. Anyways, the reason Maps is so good and the reason that they were able to keep it free is because they make money elsewhere. And all of that money makes for one big cash pool, which Google can draw from. When you split these companies up, which is what some people want, the issue is you have to be pretty severe about it. You can't go halfway. So for instance, if you say we're going to split it up, but they can still work with each other, i.e. you can think of it like Alphabet, which is basically what Google has chosen to be under. Like Google decided to split up in a way, so they made a new organization called Alphabet, under which all of the companies exist, under which all of the Google businesses exist. If you say that we just want something like this, the competitive advantage that you are trying to give to other companies will not happen, because all of the advantages that these monopolies have due to their scale, they remain. So what you have to do is you have to prevent resource sharing. You have to prevent all of those benefits that happen because of the size. And at that point is exactly when you start harming consumers directly. So yeah, like if you don't have data from each business feeding every other business, and all of that leading to each of those individual businesses doing better, each of those individual businesses for each of these companies will have worse products. They might need to make things more expensive. They will give you things that are not as good as what they were used to, what consumers were used to. So in essence, the sheer scale is what is keeping these products good. So if you have to break it up, you have to break it up entirely and destroy that scale. And so, yes, you create a more even ground for competition, but you also lead to like generally worse products. But also, the argument isn't entirely meritless in the sense that big tech is often pretty aggressive when it comes to like threat elimination. So one is what we already discussed. So in terms of acquiring businesses that pose a threat, there's also like a very distinct distinct kill zone within the startup industry. So whenever a startup starts to look profitable or starts to look lucrative, or even like has the potential to be lucrative, it gets bought. And the way that they get bought is often like pretty extreme. So for instance, there's often the choice of you taking a lowball offer from one of these companies or facing extermination. So in the sense that like it's not like literal extermination, in the sense that these bigger companies are just as capable of replicating the idea and doing it much better than these smaller companies. And so it often becomes the generous thing. It often appears that these companies are being generous when they offer you a lowball offer to just buy you out. Similarly, another strategy that's often used is acquiring competitors. So like in this regard, Twitter once acquired Periscope, which was a live streaming thing. And the reason it did that was because it wanted to eliminate another competitor called Meerkat. And so generally, these smaller companies, they don't have like a lot of wiggle room or like a lot of say in what happens to them. Also, sometimes because of these acquisitions, the original product that was acquired through the acquisition is often discarded. And then the same idea is brought into a proprietary product by these big companies. So for example, Google purchased Picasa, and then Picasa eventually was shelved, and Google started going all out on photos. This isn't a bad thing necessarily, in the sense that the product still lives on, but like under a different name. Other ways in which smaller companies face threats is basically just they get out recruited, in the sense that bigger companies just have a lot more resources. But like, I think the most important issue right now in terms of competition being limited isn't really a fault of these big tech companies. It more has to do with the lack of any new frontiers on which to like innovate. So like generally when these smaller companies get big, it's because they found some kind of niche and they exploited and explored and made good products within that niche. So when the internet and like smartphones became a thing, Google and Facebook expanded. And if the internet and smartphones were not a thing, it's presumable that those companies would be much smaller than they are right now, and Microsoft's complete domination over the space would continue. So like it's more because there's a plateau in the technology space and less because of like the monopolies themselves. So breaking up these companies might just like have nothing to do with why competition can't really do well anymore. But yeah, there is that. So as a result of all of these things, when startups face so much pressure, what then happens is that the venture capitalists that fund these startups, they hesitate to invest because the main motivation for investing is that the business eventually gets bigger, you get a big slice of that pie, lots of money. But if often what happens is these businesses are just getting bought, there's like much less incentive for venture capitalists to step in and provide money to keep these businesses afloat, which means at the end of the day, you have less startups, less ideas. So to that end, perhaps some of the complaints are legitimate, but remains to be seen. Next, we explored the flip side of this, which is not to be understated because there is a very generous flip side. So a lot of these smaller businesses are actually here and they actually exist because of many of the big tech companies. The way this works is the larger companies often provide the infrastructure for these smaller companies. Amazon Web Services, which we discussed earlier, is one of those infrastructure packages that smaller companies use. In fact, a study shows that 100,000 of these companies use these infrastructures, and these are very expensive to build on your own. So given that these things can be simply rented now from bigger companies and used for your own business, one might instead argue that these companies have enabled many more businesses to actually prop up, to actually come up, businesses that would not have existed otherwise. Similarly, one of the complaints is that venture capitalists aren't providing first round financing anymore, and first round financing for startups is reducing. But some argue that this is actually because first round financing isn't necessary anymore, because companies can get off the ground without requiring external financing because of the solutions provided by bigger companies. So, it's really complex. There is no right answer to the effect of big tech on smaller companies, because at the end of the day, many companies exist because of big tech, but it's also legitimate to argue that big tech buys out most companies when they become a threat. Lastly, a lot of these companies want to be bought out. So, for example, it's often a deliberate exit strategy. You make a decentish product, and then you're up for sale, and that usually means quick liquidation for the owners. And those owners of those smaller companies, they don't disappear. So generally what happens is the entire company is recapitalized. The owner retains some equity within that for that product. So they get more shares of so the company that's purchasing the smaller company, the owner of the smaller company gets some shares. And so the owners don't disappear, and they generally retain control of the product in itself. So after being bought, they still run the product within the larger company. So yeah, it's really complicated, and there is no right answer to this question. Also, this random comment from the internet really sums up the symbiotic relationship that these companies have, the bigger companies and the smaller companies, in the sense that Android was purchased by Google in 2005. It was an internal project that at the time really didn't mean much. It was not the Android we know today. It was just a small project that was a thing back in 2005. So Google bought it, made it into a full-fledged operating system that is largely free to use or inexpensive. And so you have all these budget smartphones that are now run on Android, and you have all these services that are made possible because of these larger companies. And so it really makes you think about the effect that these companies have, and how none of these things would have been possible if they didn't have the scale that they did have, and if they didn't just buy it off of a smaller company, because presumably most smaller companies would not have been able to materialize these projects into such fully furnished products. Also, this discussion is incomplete without looking at the other big tech hubs. So the US big tech hub is just one. And so the most prominent competitor for in this space is probably China, Beijing, where you have companies like Baidu, Huawei, and Alibaba. They too have the same characteristics as American big tech, in the sense that they have incredible scale, resources, access to information. But also there's one fundamental difference, which is that they have very intimate ties with the government. So this enables them to access information and harvest personal data on a scale that is unimaginable in the West, which gives them a very clear advantage, competitive advantage over companies in the West. And so in light of this, if Washington chooses to break up big tech in the United States, presumably this makes American big tech even less globally competitive when it comes to its Chinese counterparts. Not only do they have the same scale, they have much more access to information, and they have a government that doesn't get in the way as much, which means they presumably will be offering better products should we hinder the United States big tech industry. And so that's also something that's important to consider. Right, so now we begin the primary digression in this episode. So now we're going to be discussing the implications of data, how data needs to be handled, ethical AI, things like that. All of these are concepts that relate to big tech because often they're the pioneers in many of these areas, and what they do and how they do it reflects on the general industry. So it's important to discuss. So the way that a lot of algorithms these days that are based on data work is that there's a notion of how the world works in the form of data. Data captures how the world works, and algorithms use these data. They internalize the data, and they then make predictions about how the world will work based on the data of how it did in the past. And generally, this has turned out really well. So for things like cancer detection, for things like classifying text, things like detecting digits written on the wall, stuff like that, it has worked really well. But there are a lot of implications for this when it is applied to social aspects. Namely, the data needs to be, namely, there are certain properties of the data that can lead to problematic issues for people. So the first thing that we need to discuss is that the data that feeds algorithms is often not very representational. So when it comes to data, there are three buzzwords. I'll just discuss two of them, the ones that I think are necessary. One is volume. You need a lot of data for the algorithm to be accurate, which is pretty evident. Like if you have more learned experiences, you can make better predictions. The other is variety, and that's really important. So if you don't have varied data that covers all sorts of cases, the algorithm that you're training is often not going to be very good for certain types of people or certain test cases. So the most common, so it has been found through research that the most common category of people in every medical data set is almost always white adult men. Now, this might seem harmless because these are medical data sets, so presumably they're going to be providing things like X-rays, scans of their lungs, and stuff like that. But there are minute differences between the genders and also between races. And so once medical data sets are developed based on a very skewed representation of the world, those algorithms themselves become really limited to the point where they might not even apply. So to give you an example, women in sub-Saharan Africa have been diagnosed with breast cancer on average a lot earlier than women in Europe. Now, the reasons for this is a function of many different factors. Some say it's geographical because of the environment, some say it's because of racial differences, and so on. It's not the subject of this discussion. The point is that there is a difference. And so if AI tools were developed based on mammograms from European women, and most of these women are older because women in Europe have been found to diagnose contracting breast cancer later in their lives. And so most of these women are older. And so if you make an AI system that is built on this data set, it is very likely that the results will not travel well when applied to women in sub-Saharan Africa. And so the data needs to represent different types of people for the resulting algorithm to be useful. And the issue is often that data from underprivileged communities is often rare. And so it is difficult to represent what they want, or it is difficult to represent how things might affect them. Another very interesting consideration here is that a study based in Chicago, from the University of Chicago, wanted to see how long it took to discharge patients from the hospital. And they found the strangest of correlations. They found that zip codes were one of the biggest contributors to how long it would take a person to be discharged from the hospital, i.e., where a person lived had a profound influence on how long it took that person to be discharged from a hospital. Upon further investigation, it was found that zip codes that are primarily from poorer African American neighborhoods, people from those places, typically took the longest to be discharged from the hospital. The study had good motivations. The motivation for the study was they wanted to find out, they wanted to predict how long it would take for someone to be discharged from the hospital. So when the time was right, they could connect the give them more priority with doctors so they could be discharged earlier. So the motivation was efficiency. But the conclusion is dangerous. The conclusion suggests that African American people spend more time in the hospital, which is clearly flawed. And so, like, just basic inference based on the nature of the zip codes tells you, because those zip codes are probably poorer zip codes, the people there probably do not go to the hospital for mild symptoms. They probably wait it out and then they go when the symptoms are more severe. Just one possible explanation for why it takes longer. But the issue is, that is what the algorithm is saying. It's saying that African American people take longer in the hospital. And so the data that's feeding these algorithms, it then needs to, so it's clear that it needs to be much more feature rich. It needs to account for these extenuating circumstances like wealth inequalities or geographical conditions which lead to these things, or else it can lead to very pernicious conclusions. Similarly, a study by Nature magazine again finds that Black people in US emergency rooms are 40% less likely to receive pain medication than are white people. If an algorithm were to be developed, if an AI system were to be developed based on data like this, it would suggest that a Black person being operated is less likely to need pain medication than the white person. Again, incredibly problematic. So basically, to sum it up, what these algorithms do is that they regurgitate social bigotry. But because this is science and because this is an algorithm, there's an added layer of authenticity. So it's clear what kind of responsibility these big tech companies have in that case, because they definitely need to operate under ethical AI guidelines. So if you are going to get into a study, if you're going to make a machine learning system, unless the data is representational, unless it's thorough enough, you shouldn't begin that study because the conclusions might be really problematic. Similarly, there are risk assessment algorithms that convert your social background into criminal risk. So if you're from a certain race or if you're from a certain area, you might be labeled as someone who is more at risk of being a criminal, which again is problematic because these things are probably has less to do with the race and has much more to do, it has nothing to do with the race and has much more to do with the situation that exists within those areas. But the conclusion seems very obvious and the conclusion seems very problematic. And so companies need to be much more conscious of how they handle that data. Next, we arrive at data security. This is another area where there's been a lot of controversy lately in terms of the data that these companies have, that they have too much data, they know too much, also they're susceptible to breaches, susceptible to exploitation, things like that. So by and large, the concern is legitimate in the sense that, like, through different areas in which they gather information, most of these companies know just about everything. It is mind-boggling how much they know. With that in mind, I think the more pertinent question is there a harm in them knowing? Now, obviously, data belongs to the person from which it is generated. So at the point at which this data is used to give services back to the user, one might argue that it's fine. So for instance, a lot of the services that you use on a very regular basis from these tech companies, they require the data that you send them. They also require the data for it to be, for the service to be good. So for example, to give you better suggestions, they require your preferences, things like that, and that's fine. Another issue is when that data is used to sell you more personalized content, which even then one might argue is okay, and it is in many contracts. When you sign up, you agree to be advertised better based on your data. I suppose the main issue is with data being sold without your knowledge, and also with data breaches. As for the first issue, a lot of these things is just speculation, because there are a lot of theories that suggest that, yes, companies do in fact exchange and sell your data, but without, and there are one or two cases in which it has been established that this happens, but without like extensive proof or like without like solid knowledge on whether these things do happen, I think it's unwise to comment. So I will be commenting on data breaches which is another very genuine issue where companies get hacked into, information is lost, and what that would look like if companies didn't have so much data, or if the data was distributed between a lot of smaller companies. What are bad incentives that bigger companies have with your data? I've discussed most of these just now: selling your data, using it to advertise, and so on. The thing is, harking back to the breaking up big tech companies debate, one has to wonder what that world would look like if we didn't have big companies, if we had a bunch of smaller companies that had individual lots of data, which presumably is not as big as the data collection that one big company would have had. So one might argue that smaller companies have all of these incentives and more, because smaller companies possibly have more incentive to sell your data than bigger companies, because bigger companies use that data internally and they make a lot of money off of it internally. A smaller company that has a very niche business doing one transaction with you probably doesn't have a lot of purpose with your data beyond whatever they do, beyond the transaction that they're having with you. So presumably, those incentives probably exist with smaller companies, but to an even larger extent. Again, this is speculation. This is just debate land speculation. On the counter argument to this is probably that smaller companies, the information they have is generally not comprehensive enough for it to be dangerous. So for instance, studies have found that based on the wide variety of information that some large conglomerate companies have, it is possible to deduce things like sexual orientation and all of those things, those sorts of preferences. Those things require a really broad base of knowledge for you to make inferences on. And one would argue that if large companies didn't exist and data existed individually among smaller pockets of companies, those sorts of inferences would probably not be possible because the data isn't comprehensive enough. There is that. The more interesting question, I think, is who protects your data better? And I think the conclusion here is much more clear. So the first thing we need to consider is that cybersecurity is incredibly expensive. It's $1 billion industry. It costs a lot of money to protect data. And the largest companies, by virtue of them being large, by virtue of them having the most resources, generally have the best cybersecurity. In a world where you don't have big companies, and if you contrast how smaller companies handle data, smaller companies get hacked into much more frequently. They also generally have a hard time affording the cybersecurity bills. And as a result of which, if you had to trust a company with your data, presumably based on what we know, a larger company might probably handle it well. However, on the contrary, you can then argue that because larger companies have bigger banks of data, they are bigger targets for data for hackers and stuff. And so smaller companies would likely not be on the radar as much. So again, really muddy, no real conclusions, but I think still there's a general notion that a larger company might be able to protect your data better. So I think the last issue that needs discussion is in terms of ownership. So for example, who really owns data and what happens with the data? So for instance, if in a transaction, a user agrees to exchange data for some service, or because the user is trying to access the service, some data needs to be sent. In that case, ownership for the data is possibly mutual. Both companies own it. But in a lot of cases, when data is publicly available and when that data can be gathered by other parties, and that data can be used to the benefit of other parties in that they get to train their systems to do better predictions or make better conclusions. Who then owns the data? And does the original creator of said data not have any, should the original owner of that data not be credited for creating that data in some way? So this leads to the interesting concept of like compensating users for their data, which in and of itself sounds like a very good thing to do, because intuitively if people are creating data, if that data is making profit for someone else, that should, in principle, trickle back to the people that are generating that data. However, this is pretty complex because data is only useful in, it's not only useful in macro, but in general, data is most useful in a large scale. So, for example, most people, to the algorithm is just a statistic. So, for instance, like most data sets are enormous, and the value from the data of the data set relies on the enormity of the data set and not on any individual column or row within that data set. So what this means is it's very difficult to gauge what the value of an individual contribution to data really is. And so even if it were to be about compensating people for their data, it would be very difficult because it's difficult to assess the value that each individual brings to a data set. I think that in conclusion, so what we need to then discuss is how should a user whose data is publicly available on the internet or whose data is can be publicly collected, can be used, what options exist for that user? So presumably if a user doesn't want that to be on the internet, what can that user do? So I think here is the biggest issue for any user, because there's no universal opt-out system from data marketing. There are firms, there are brokering firms that calculate that gather user data, and they are gathering publicly available data. So it's technically not illegal, but it's still being gathered. And that data can be sold around, can change hands. So if a user were to want to remove their data from the internet, it's a very complicated process because the data collection is so distributed. There are so many places that have little bits of your information which can be put together by an external party if they want to, and conclusions can be made. And so if someone were to want to opt out, they would probably have to use services that scrape information away from the internet. An example is there on the slide. They charge a pretty penny for doing that on a yearly basis. So I think this is the part that's really unfortunate. It's that the digital footprint that each user inadvertently leaves on the internet is really hard to scrub out. But also, these are the same complaints that people have with big tech in terms of them collecting very large amounts of information. But I think the way that big tech handles that information is better in terms of the fact that most of what they do with that information is internal, as opposed to random data brokering firms that can just collect this information and send them elsewhere. So on a comparative, I suppose they're doing it better. But again, this issue too is very muddy. There is no good answer for this. But in general, ownership of data in the modern age is really complicated because it gets really vague as to who really has a claim over that data after a certain point. So I think that concludes this discussion on big tech. I hope it was useful. I'm sorry because it was really unstructured and a little all over the place at times, but I hope people found it useful. That's about it. Hope everyone is having a good time. Stay safe.